Welcome to the Legal Leaders Podcast with Ali Rock.
Hi, my name is Tifani Sadek. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan Law School, where I teach in and direct the Zell Entrepreneurship Clinic. So this is a clinic for upper-level law students who are getting to practice law for the first time under my supervision. In addition to teaching this, I also do legal research through MCity and the Law and Mobility Program, where my focus is on connected and autonomous cars.
Hey, Tiffany, thank you so much for joining us today for the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Awesome. I'd love to start with some icebreakers. So I'd love to know, if salary was not an issue, what profession or job would you be doing other than being
this is an interesting one. I was just talking about this. This is an odd one, but I find I maybe the one person in the world, I love writing resumes and cover letters. So I get asked for a lot of advice from students and other people I know that are seeking to get into startup law or just different types of different industries. And I always look at their cover letters and their resumes and always give them a lot of feedback. But I actually really like writing them. I like interviewing them and getting a hold of their story and then trying to craft that based on what the future employer is looking for. I don't know why I really enjoy doing that, but I do. It's a little bit of interviewing and getting to know people's story and then trying to use your communication skills as a writer to convey that to someone else. So if I won the lotto, I'd probably just do that for free for people.
Amazing. I know who to come to write my resume.
Yes.
And then second one is, who is your favorite artist?
Oh. Artist being very broad, like any type of art.
I meant more
Music
like music. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Beyonce. That one's easy. And I feel like that's such an easy answer because she's such a big star now. But I'm from Houston, and it's just one of the people you watched, way back when she was in Destiny's Child version 1, Destiny's Child version 2. And so I've always loved Beyonce, even when she was, like unknown. And so I love to see how big she is. I've seen her in different places in the world, and she doesn't know who I am, but it's been cool to kind of watch her progress throughout her career. We're in similar age range. We both have kids. So, as she reinvents herself over time, I just have a particular appreciation for that.
Amazing. I do love Jay-Z as well, personally.
Yeah.
But
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Cool. I'd love to just begin the podcast by spending some time understanding your background and where you started from and what your path was to actually become a professor at the University of Michigan. So maybe we can take it back to your time at Texas A&M in Texas, and you can talk about what undergrad was like and if you knew you wanted to be a lawyer.
Yeah. No, as you'll hear, my story is really me trying to figure out what I like and what I want to do. So I'm the first person in my family to go to college, let alone law school. Most of my family honestly did not graduate from high school. And so I didn't have a lot of direction. I had a lot of well wishes, but not a lot of direction and not a lot of examples to look to as to different types of career or, what I should study. So I kind of just followed what I was feeling in the moment all of the time. So I have always loved science since I was very, very little. And I thought I really wanted to be a scientist. So that's what took me to Texas A&M, was wanting to study biology and genetics. Honestly, even me getting to college was a little bit of a fluke because I didn't know anything about, the SAT or even looking at colleges. Until my school counselor was like, have you signed up for this test? Are you thinking about colleges? And so she really pushed me. Otherwise, I might not have even been on track to get to college, let alone where I am today. So I, went to the local state school not too far from home, studied something that was interesting to me, thought I wanted to be a researcher. And I worked in a research lab for one of my professors for 3 years. And during that time, I found research really wasn't what I wanted to do. It was a little, there's a difference between what you think the job is and what the job is. And I had to take this 1 credit class as a biology major, as a biology major, and it was careers in science that aren't scientists. And every week somebody would come and speak to us about their career. And one day a patent attorney came in. And I thought that was super interesting because, like a lot of people that are interested in law school, they've probably been told many times, oh, you should be a lawyer because they maybe like to argue or debate or whatever. But I had heard that. And I thought this patent attorney thing is the perfect mix of science and law. You have to be a lawyer, but you have to also stay up in the art, state of the art of the science, in order to write a good patent. So that's what put me on the path to law school. I had no idea where I wanted to go to law school. University of Virginia must have sent me a great brochure, because for some reason I was really stuck on the University of Virginia. I had not even traveled outside of the state of Texas at this point. I had never visited UVA. I didn't know anyone who went to UVA, but in my head, that's where I wanted to go. So I applied
Wow.
early decision, and that's where I went. It wound up being, I mean, I'm very lucky. It wound up being an amazing fit for me, and I loved my time there. But it was also just very random.
That's really impressive. So you're a first generation college student and you ended up going to one of the best law schools in the US, UVA. And can I ask, what was your LSAT journey like?
Oh, geez. Again, didn't know anything, didn't even know what questions to ask. So I definitely could not afford a prep course. So I bought a book. I think it was called Kaplan 180, and it's full of some of the hardest LSAT questions there are. So you kind of get used to taking only the hard ones. And when you get to the test, you're like, okay, this isn't as bad as what I was practicing. One thing that I tell a lot of applicants now is it is incredibly common to take the LSAT multiple times to try and get your best score. I would say it's more common than not. It's not something I knew. I just didn't know any of these things. So I took it once. I got a pretty good score, but not a great score, below median at UVA. And still, that's luckily I still got in. I applied early, had a really compelling personal statement, and it didn't keep me from getting to the school that I really wanted to go to.
Amazing. Well, that's super awesome. I'd love to ask, you're obviously a professor at University of Michigan Law School now. How does law school nowadays compare to when you went to law school?
Geez. Something I notice as a professor is how much more involved I am with my students than was the case, 20 years ago, when I was in law school. And I used to think maybe this is a thing that's particular to Michigan. And I think we are more involved in our law students' lives here, but it's something that's ramped up, I think, at all schools. Students really want more access to professors, and a lot of the barriers are broken down. And so, a lot of my students have been to my house. I see, I live in a college town. I see them around a lot, but I have more one-on-ones. I just spend more time with my students and I get to know them really well. And I keep up with them after they graduate. When I'm traveling, I'll stop and have a coffee with them, or lunch whenever I'm in New York or Chicago or San Francisco. And I don't know, that wasn't not that I didn't have great professors. It's just that wasn't the norm when I was in law school. I think that there's more students that I went straight through from undergrad to law school. I definitely see a trend of more students taking time in between undergrad and law school now, even if it's not much time, even if it's just a year, but they get some experience, maybe in the legal field, maybe not, maybe just something they just want to go do for a year and get that experience, that personal enjoyment of the experience that they're doing, and then come to law school with that under their belt.
Amazing. And two more questions. How would you say the value of a JD? Has it increased or decreased over time? And also, how can folks go about knowing if pursuing a JD is right for them?
Yeah. The first year salaries for big law associates, at least, has gone up quite a bit, but it just increases the pressure too, right? I mean, they're paying you that much money. They're expecting a return on that salary they're paying. Um, Another thing, I graduated in 2008, right into the Great Recession. And so immediately, I luckily made it through without getting laid off or having my offer pulled. But I'd say about half of my classmates, really suffered that fate. And I
Wow.
just, for us that didn't, we were still worried about it for years, worried if we were going to lose our jobs and then have this huge, student loan debt on top of us. And it was very stressful, but I think it also severed the relationship that we had with our idea of our profession, or our industry, right? It became very transactional. And I think you see this across a lot of industries with generations, but it became less like, my parents' age, where it's like you work for your employer and, this relationship, and you're loyal to them. And it became very transactional for us. And so I think you saw that with people not being afraid to move around, shift their careers. If this isn't working out for me, I'm going to go do something else, and not feeling bad about that. And not feeling like you owe something, like I'm getting paid, and I'm giving you a service. This is very transactional. And I see that if we walk, the next generation is running, because I already see students thinking and talking about life after law, or something they want to do with this law degree that maybe isn't traditional. And maybe they'll go to a law firm and stay in that, but maybe they won't. And they're just already thinking about that, and more so than I did, and my classmates did, when I was in law school. I definitely think we thought, let's try this law firm thing and let's see how long we can stick it out, and then we'll figure something else out. Whereas my students now are thinking, okay, I'll go for a few years and then I'm doing something else, and let me go ahead and start putting things in motion for my career after big law.
Amazing. So you would say the value of a JD has remained about the same or increased since 2008?
Oh, I only have the perspective of like corporate law, right? So I'm coming all at this from big law perspective, in-house at big corporations or startups. I think in technology, at least where I have been, the value of the lawyer has increased. I think you're starting to see, you'll see it in subtle shifts. One, for example, I was involved in connected vehicles, right, at General Motors. And back in the day, you have these companies that would create a product or create a service, go through all the product development, and then take it to the lawyers at the end and say, hey, does this look good? Do we get the check? And now you see lawyers being pulled in much earlier, right? For compliance reasons, for privacy law reasons, or just whatever. The way we problem solve and think, we're useful around the table other than just law. And so I was involved in really early conversations in different product development or service development. And I think that's not the case everywhere, but you're starting to see that shift of thinking as the lawyer as an integral part of the team versus just the law person. So you'll see that in subtle shifts, like instead of calling the top lawyer, the general counsel, you still see that, but you really start to see like chief legal officer. Like, let's think about them as COO, CFO, CLO, and CEO, right? Because it's just this reflection that they are a C-level executive and part of the conversation. So I think you start to see law less as something that you just comply with at the end of the day, and it can be something that is, a value proposition. It can drive like something for the customer. And so I think people are thinking about law strategically as a part of their business plan, more so than they have in the past, for sure. That's for sure.
Amazing. That makes total sense. Awesome. I'd love to talk more about that, about your role at GM and about automation, that sort of thing. But before that, I'd love to talk about your experience in big law doing commercial litigation.
Yes. Yeah. So this plays into me not knowing what I was doing. So I went to law school to be a patent lawyer. I did an externship writing patents for the tech transfer office at the University of Virginia, which was similar to like doing a clinic. We didn't really have as many clinics back then, but it gave you the experience while you're still in school. And I just realized it wasn't something I wanted to do. And so I wasn't sure then what I would do. And I knew lawyers went to court. That's what I saw on TV. So I thought, okay, that's what I'll do. So I went into IP litigation, which was real, and then also complex commercial litigation. It was less, this is what fits my personality. This is what fits my career goals, and more like, I guess this is what I do now. So yes, I started my career off as a litigator in big law for 6 years before I switched to a completely different kind of law.
Nice. And why did you make that switch?
I just had a moment of reflection because I was 6 years out, and there are a few reasons. I was at a big law firm, and around 6 years, that's when you start to think about, am I going to make partner here? And at a lot of law firms, when you go up for partner, you sort of need to make your pitch as to why you should be brought in as a member of the company or as a shareholder. And so you talk about what's your specialty, what's your book of business, what do you bring to the partnership? And it makes you think about, what do I want that to be too? And so I just had that moment of reflection of, do I like what I'm doing? Like, where do I see myself in the next 10 years? And I realized I really wasn't enjoying what I was doing all that much anymore. And this is not, I'm big in class about saying there's not good and bad in careers. They just are what they are, and you need to figure out what's a good match for you. And so it's more that litigation wasn't a great match for me. But
Mm.
also, I had moved from Chicago, where I was practicing, to the city of Detroit. My husband is an attorney too. We both went to law school, graduated at the same time, and went to big law firms. And we just wanted to, pay off our student debt and buy a house and live in a city that was Chicago was amazing. I love it, but also a little expensive. And so we moved to Detroit so that we could buy a house, really, really cheaply, but still be around the city, professional sports, museums, bars, and restaurants, the things that we like to do. But Detroit, other people were moving to Detroit for that same reason because of the low cost of living. So there was a big entrepreneurship boom in Detroit at the time. And because I lived in the city, I was one of the young professionals that had moved back to the city. I was maybe the only lawyer they knew. And so they'd say, "Oh, you're a lawyer. I need help with this, or I need help with that." And I would think, I'm a litigator, I'm at Big Law. This is not something I can do for you, but let me find someone. And then that's when I realized there wasn't anyone that could help them, right? I couldn't even make a referral. There weren't startup lawyers in the city of Detroit. And I had been around entrepreneurs enough at that point to realize, like, there's a method behind the madness of entrepreneurship. You're not just, I mean, some people are, natural entrepreneurs, but it's also something that can be learned, and you kind of follow a path to starting a business. So I thought, okay, there's a market for this. There's no one addressing that market. Maybe I can do this. Take the lessons I've learned from my entrepreneurship friends and start my own business as a lawyer, as a startup lawyer.
Super inspirational. So you pivoted from commercial litigation to becoming a startup lawyer.
Yes, yes. Having not taken any transactional type classes or a transactional clinic, or even through the summer internship, rotated through any transactional department. So I knew as much as a 1L about transactional law at that point. Other than
Wow.
having, taken contracts apart and litigating them, I wasn't really sure what went into that. So had to learn on
Wow.
the fly.
Really impressive. So I imagine it was a steep learning curve. So, I mean, what were some of the challenges of starting your own law firm that maybe a lot of people don't think about?
I mean, you're starting a business, and I don't think I appreciated that I was starting a business. I don't know. Sometimes we think of the law practice as different, but all of the administrative side of things, marketing, finding an office, making your pitch to clients. I mean, you're a business just like anything else. You'll find there's help both informally and paid help for everything you want to do in life. And there was a consultant that I had met when I was in Big Law who helped lawyers leave big law firms and start their own practice. It's like a personal trainer, right? Like sometimes, yeah, maybe you could do these things on your own, but it was nice to have someone there for accountability, someone who has seen other people go through this process. Tiffany is going to be okay, but she was great, and that was the help I needed. I worked with her every other week for about 6 months. And so some of what I worked on her with were reflective exercises, like what kind of lifestyle do you want this firm to lead to? Do you want to build a firm that grows into a bigger firm? Do you want a lifestyle type law practice where you have a nice, relaxing lifestyle? Do you want to work with a particular kind of client? So questions like that, and
Wow.
then helping me put together the business plan, knowing different resources and connections and her network. And so that was really helpful. And she had me circle a date on the calendar of, this is the day you're going to put in your notice. And it was October 31st, and I wound up leaving October 22nd. So I beat it by nine
Wow.
days. But I kind of needed that. I needed that accountability and that partner to help me out with that. So that was
Amazing.
a huge help.
It really just speaks to how important mentorship can be. I mean, and
Absolutely.
how do folks go about finding a mentor like this if they wanted to do something like what you did?
Yeah. I mean, part of it, honestly, was a little bit of luck. I met her at a networking event for lawyers, and I don't really go to a lot of those. I think I was at one of the bigger ones, and just talking to people and meeting people, right? Like you're networking, really, that's just meeting people, and you might not have an immediate need for that relationship, but like I met her maybe a year before, and I just, that's interesting, and kept her card, and so I knew that she existed. So I
Yeah.
think just meeting people and putting it out there. Like it's really hard to talk about our dreams or our struggles, but people are helpers. People want to help. And if you talk to people and say, this is what I'm facing, this is what I need, they might know somebody. Now your network's expanding exponentially. So that's the
Yeah.
hard part. It was hard to leave a big law firm and say I was going to start my own thing.
Yeah.
Everyone
This-
thought I was a little cuckoo. Like, why are you leaving this to go do something like, you don't know what you're doing,
Yeah.
and so it made me not want to tell people, right? Because I got positive feedback from my entrepreneur friends, but from other lawyers, I did not. And so I maybe not want to tell anybody, which is the opposite of what I should have been doing, right? You should tell everybody, hey, I'm going to offer this service and send people my way. And I got there eventually, but at first I was very, you say you're putting your notice and they're like, what are you going to go do? And you just like starting my own practice, And so
Yeah.
I
It
learned
takes a
to
lot of
put myself
guts
out
to do
there.
that.
Absolutely.
It's not easy to do that, to quit a job like that. I'm sure you're making a lot of money to go
Mhm.
and start your own firm. I'd love to just double click on the statement about how important the network is. Maybe you can talk about the importance of maintaining connections with your fellow classmates in law school and how
Yes.
important that can be down the line.
Absolutely. You don't realize that all of you are starting out and then you're all going to be, rising to different levels simultaneously. And so it's like when I go back, I just went back to my 15-year reunion and everyone's, partners and general counsels and someone's a federal judge. And I was like, we were all just in this together. And
Wow.
so maintaining those connections can be really important. It's so easy nowadays, right? With social media and LinkedIn and go to your reunions. You feel like I don't want to go. I was just there 5 years ago. It's amazing, and I wound up talking to people and hanging out with people that maybe I wasn't even friends with in law school, but we're in different places now, and we hit it off during one of the meetups or something like that, and staying in touch. So
Yeah.
it can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, it's cliche, but the saying that your network is your net worth is very
Mhm.
highly accurate.
Yeah.
I'd love to ask you about, what kind of startups were in Detroit? What kind of founders were you working with? And also, like, were you typically charging by hour? Was there any opportunity to get equity as you were giving legal counsel?
Yeah. So this, I was learning as I went. There weren't a lot of great examples out there because this was 2013. And so when I first started out, to know Detroit is to love Detroit. I'm not a Detroiter, I'm from Texas, but I really wanted to work with Detroit startups and Detroit small businesses, especially. Detroit's been trying to come back for so long. And I think what we realized is there's not a magic bullet that's going to fix Detroit, right? We kind of fix it from the ground level up and helping people start neighborhood businesses that were then going to hire people from those same neighborhoods, small bit by small bit. That's how Detroit, really can work itself back to where it wants to be. And so I really worked with a lot of small businesses like that, and that kind of entrepreneur. And then I started working more, as I got more comfortable. I mean, those types of transactions and that type of legal work is a lot more straightforward. And you can find that information on how to do those things a lot easier than some of the tech stuff. And so I also wanted there. My office was in an incubator called Tech Town, which
Oh,
is
it's
in
like a co-working space.
it's like a co-working space, and it's also sort of like a hub for a lot of the tech startups in Detroit. So there's a lot of programming, both from the university, Wayne State University, which is right there, from the city. It's just a hub for the entrepreneurial zone of Detroit. And so it was great for me, one, to be around a lot of startups and entrepreneurs, and it's also where I met my other key mentor, who was a attorney on the other end of his career. He had been a tech attorney for 30 years, had mostly been in-house counsel and general counsel at tech companies, and left to start his own practice helping startups who were going through small to medium size acquisitions and mergers. Maybe didn't want to go with a really big law firm, but needed someone to guide them through that. So maybe like a 10 to $50 million acquisition, they might go to him. And so he was by himself, and his office was just down the hallway from mine. And so sometimes deals would be a little bigger than he could handle on his own, and he needed basically an associate. And so he would tap me and mentor me and teach me how to do some of these deals, and then bill me out and pay me and then bill me out almost like an associate. And so
Wow.
that was amazing because I learned, that is how I learned how to do some of the more complicated transactions. The other ones I could teach. There's a lot of help out there, if you need it, in order to teach yourself how to do some of these things. But I also had this backup mentor when I wasn't quite sure. I could always just go down to his office and say, hey, can you look over this paperwork, or help, let's do this transaction together. And so that was fantastic as well.
Really speaks again to the power of finding a mentor and how
Mhm.
important that is for learning. And Tiffany, what kind of startups or small businesses were you mostly helping in Detroit?
I would say it was kind of 50-50, just the neighborhood restaurants, coffee shops, oh gosh, just any kind of neighborhood business you can think of when you walk down Main Street and you see those kinds of businesses. So helping them with leases, reviewing leases. So there were stores, just home goods stores, reviewing leases, helping them hire people. And I worked with nonprofits that wanted to start up in Detroit, helping them get their tax exemption, helping the entity set up. And then I started switching to some of the more tech entrepreneur type things. So there was like a 3D printing company that was also working in the software space. There was a company that wanted to be sort of like the next Spotify. It was really just all over the place. And with those companies, I helped them get their entity started up, spread out equity, apply vesting schedules, work with funding. Some of them were getting their first seed round, so negotiating those and help explaining the process through all of that. And some I worked really, really closely with and did take equity you have to be careful with this, with taking equity in a client, because it puts you in an ethical conflict, right? So if you are taking equity and now you're a part of the company, you have a vested interest in this, right? How can I, when I'm a part founder, give counsel that's not conflicting, or that's not a conflict to my other co-founders, and like, yeah, this is a really good operating agreement, right? When I have a vested interest in that. So you have to be really careful. And if you're going to do that, it might conflict you out of some of the work that you might have with that particular client. So I did that occasionally, but only actually in businesses where I was more like a co-founder or just more involved. Maybe not a complete co-founder, but just, it wasn't like I was just doing a little bit of legal work. It was more like, okay, I'm part of the team. And so I'm going to, take equity and help this business grow, but I wasn't just the lawyer, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. That makes total sense. Really impressive that you started that. And that obviously set you up to now lead the Zell Entrepreneurship Clinic, which maybe like looking back on in hindsight, it was 2020, this pathway to now lead this, whole institution at University of Michigan. So, and I'd love to talk more about that later on. But before that, maybe you could talk more about the first of all, the work you did with the Public Lighting Authority of Detroit, and then maybe go into your work at GM.
Yes. So this is where I say my career path is me figuring out what I like to do. So I loved the job that I had. I loved having my own law practice. I eventually took on a partner, another attorney who wanted to leave a big law firm and do something. This is what she wanted to do. And she just blind emailed me and was like, hey, I want to do something similar. Can I talk to you about how that worked out? And after talking to her, we jived so well. I was like, do you just want to join me? And so she wound up joining me instead of doing her own thing. And it was great. It was a lot, it's running your own business. You're just, thinking about it all the time and working on it all the time. And I loved that, but it was a lot of work. I wasn't looking to leave it necessarily, but someone came knocking. And so the city of Detroit went through bankruptcy. And as a part of that bankruptcy, they started up different state agencies that were going to do services on behalf of the city of Detroit. And I had just randomly met the chief operating officer of one of those agencies at a conference. And 4 months later, he called me and was like, we need a general counsel. And we're kind of a startup. So I think a startup attorney would work. We're new, we're a government agency, but we're new. We don't have processes in place. Things are moving really, really fast. We've got to wrap this bankruptcy up. And, so I went and interviewed, and it did feel a little bit like a startup. And so I went in-house as general counsel of that agency for a little over a year as we went through bankruptcy. And so that was my first and only stint in the public sector as a government lawyer. So it was interesting. I learned a lot.
And you relit more than 65,000 streetlights, is that correct?
Yes, our job was to rebuild Detroit's street lighting system, which was pretty much defunct. Half of them didn't work, right? And so this led to more crime. I lived on a larger street in Detroit, and people would speed through because it was such a big street and there was no light, and so you had a lot of hit and runs. It was just dangerous. And so our job was to rip up the old street lighting system and put in a new street lighting system. So a lot of contract management, working with large construction companies, dealing with amendments to the contract. We were hiring and random things. We were putting up new street lights. And if you look at any street light in the country, you're going to see a lot of attachments to that. So there are leases on those street lights with some of the big telecom companies out there who want their different pieces of hardware up there. So it was a lot of contracting, a lot of contract management. And then my
Wow.
job was also legislative affairs. So, we got money from the state, the city, and the federal government. So just keeping tabs with all of the politicians who wanted to know, how's the money being spent? Are we on time? Their constituents are calling them because the lights aren't on yet, and just making sure that they were happy with us. And so that was my first dive into a little bit of politics. But also, while we were rebuilding that street lighting system, we realized that we were buying these street lights, which were brand new, and they had wireless capability, right? They could turn on a wireless network over the city of Detroit. We didn't have the funding to buy the extra module that we needed. And so I had started reaching out to a lot of the auto manufacturers to see if they were interested in forming a public-private partnership with us so that they could buy the extra technology and put it in and then have access to this wireless system that they could use to for maybe autonomous or connected vehicle testing. That was the idea. We weren't, so I started reaching out and learning a little bit about autonomous and connected vehicles through that process. And then
Wow.
we realized we couldn't do that. Our enabling, this is part of being a lawyer, the enabling statute that the legislators wrote to create our government organization had a very strict limits on what kind of activities we could engage in. And so that was not permitted by the statute. So it would have been, the partnership could have been unwound, right? Because we didn't have authority to engage in that kind of contracting. So it didn't go anywhere, unfortunately, but that's kind of what, if it feels a little random, that's kind of what led to me moving on over to General Motors after the bankruptcy and after I wound down at the agency.
Wow. Still a wildly successful project with the
Yeah,
city.
it was, I loved it. I just felt so much pride, in working on behalf of the city and my neighbors. And so we work really hard, and I really enjoyed that job. It made me appreciate those in the public sector because you were always under the microscope, right, by your constituents. And so, you're working on behalf of the public, and they have every right to be like, "What are you doing? What are you doing with our money?" And so, it was a good job. It was a hard job, and it was a job I'm really proud of.
That's wonderful. And you worked private sector, public sector, and academia. So you've seen a
Yes.
lot. So
Yes.
maybe we can talk about your time back in the private sector at GM and what you did there.
Yes. So I moved over from the lighting authority into what was then called the Global Connected Customer Experience. So it was a section of GM that dealt with the connection of cars and like connecting with the client. And then we became sort of the catch-all for different innovations. So we handled, all the apps. GM and most car makers these days have an app where you can control your car or have other fun features, like parents can tell when their teenage drivers leave a perimeter. These poor teenagers today can't sneak away.
No
Um,
privacy.
yeah, exactly. There was, there's connections with a law enforcement who can, if a car gets stolen, we can find the car, we can stop the car, so that you don't have high speed chases. So there was a element of, when the government can get into our clients or our customers' records and have access to their cars and things like that. And then the regular parts of apps. There were other apps that GM was starting both in the car. A lot of cars have apps inside of them now, on the phone, other apps that GM came up with. And then just also different innovations. Like a lot of legacy companies, everything from, the oil and gas, which is now energy, right, is what they call themselves, because they're looking at renewables. GM is like, we're a mobility company, right? Right now we do make cars, single owner, internal combustion engine cars, but this is not what's we're not gonna, if we're still doing this in 50 years, we won't be around. So what comes next? And so
Yeah.
GM, like a lot of automakers, is playing in different areas, whether it's connectivity, automation, shared mobility. GM made a huge investment in Lyft, in terms of like exploring the joint ownership model and just all kind of e-bike. We had an e-bike out there. We had Maven, which is like Zipcar. We started our own insurance company, so that we could have, offer insurance in these shared use models and not have to worry about finding some third party. So it was a lot of, entrepreneurship, but inside of a Fortune 500 company, which was an interesting place to do that.
And what were some of those challenges? I'd love to double click on the privacy issues because we've seen
Yeah.
tech companies like Apple, for example, I've seen they don't share data even if there's a, criminal activity happening. So were you actually calling these shots about, what kind of information was being shared and what were the
Yeah.
challenges surrounding that?
I mean, that absolutely. had my cell phone number, right? I get a call in the middle of the night, like this just happened. We need to know where this vehicle is. And do we want to turn this information over? And so you have to make a call, right? And you're balancing what have we told our customer? Okay, who's this for? Are we, is this going to help the customer? Is it their car that's missing and they want to find it? Of course, right? Like we're helping the customer. Let's do that. Or is this going to get our customer in trouble? What facts do you have? What's going on? And so you're balancing, what have we told our customer? What are we legally obligated to do? What's in our privacy policy? What's in our terms of service? What's the right thing to do? Right? Like, someone's like, hey, there's a kid, stuck in the car and the owner can't remember the pin for us to unlock the car. Well, open the car,
Oh, wow.
I will take the risk. You know what I mean? Like, this is on me if we're wrong, but like, open the car. It's a hot day. My baby's in the car. Open the car.
Yeah.
Just like balancing out. Okay, is there a warrant? Like, what's the warrant say? I've seen warrants before. Let me take a look at it. This warrant's really broad. Like, let's not comply with all of it. And so GM is connectivity with its vehicles has always been sold as a safety feature. And so we really tout the relationship that we have with law enforcement. Like, hey, if you get in an accident, law enforcement and first responders, if you get in an accident, like we'll know this. Now there's more cars that do this, but at the time this was only GM. We know if you're in an accident, we know how many people are in the car and how many seatbelt buckles there were, and we can call and make sure they get there. So you wanted to maintain this close relationship with first responders and law enforcement. If your car gets stolen, we'll find it. If something happens to you, we'll take care of you. And so you're balancing out like maintaining these relationships as well. So
Wow.
sometimes
That's
those calls came
pretty,
in at 2 a.m. on my cell phone when I was dead asleep, and you're trying to wake yourself up really quickly and make the best choice. But I had an
yeah.
amazing boss at GM, and he was always like, just do what's right, like do what you balance all those things out. At the end of the day, do what you feel is right.
That's amazing. Yeah. I mean, you're probably just waking up and making, in some cases, life and death decisions, I would imagine.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And this is when your personal background comes into play. Like, what has been your experience in dealing with first responders or law enforcement or an accident? Like all of these things come into play. And so I remember one time, got a call, and just so many thoughts go through your head. Like I'm balancing out client confidentiality now, but some interesting conversations to say the least. And this has been an area of research that I would love to pursue as an academic, because every company has to deal with this. If you go to Facebook or Amazon or Apple, most of them have transparency reports, and they'll tell you how many requests for information they get. And they do love to tout the times they don't turn it over, but more often than not, they're turning information over, right? And that might
yeah.
be warranted. It might be for a good cause. It might be to protect their own customer. But this is just becoming more and more and more common as we use, our services for all different kinds of things, and we give them all kinds of permissions to track us and hold our information. Law enforcement wants to use it for a lot of different reasons. So this is becoming more and more of an issue. This is why lawyers are becoming really important, as a lot of services that used to not be technical, high tech, are now high tech, right? Like there are a lot of like my refrigerator is connected to my internet, right? Like things that were not tech before are tech now, and collecting data, and all that data needs to be protected, either from a business standpoint or from a legal standpoint. And so lawyers are really getting involved super, super early in decision making on these things.
Absolutely. Technology is a wonderful thing, but it does need to be regulated.
It makes things
So,
complex, right? It makes things really complex.
absolutely. So before we move on to M City, which is really an interesting topic, I do want to just ask, broadly speaking, what should lawyers know about working in the auto industry?
Oh, I mean, I love it. I think it's really, I loved working on something and then seeing it in real life. Like I get in GM cars today and I'm like, I worked on that, or I got to see this come out. I got to drive cars years before they came out, because I had to, test the
Wow.
connectivity and make sure that it wasn't too distracting and things like that. So that was so much fun. But like GM has every kind of lawyer you can imagine. So when you work in automotive, you could be doing anything from real estate or being an environmental lawyer, because there's factories and things involved in that, to IP and patent, employment, international, negotiations with different labor firms. GM's everywhere. And so I had a lot of
Yeah.
international work. It's fun. And I think all of I don't know if this is true at every in-house company, but GM will move you around. Like I stayed in my group pretty much the entire time I was there. But had I stayed at GM longer, I would have moved to these different groups. Like we think of ourselves as a particular kind of lawyer, but unless you're tax or patent, you were being moved around, which you needed to. If you want to move up, you're going to oversee lots of different departments. And so how can you oversee employment if you've never practiced employment law? So one day you're this kind of lawyer, the next day you might be this kind of lawyer for a few years. And so I always thought that was really fascinating. And I think there's a lot of big companies that will do that. And so if you really didn't want to, you could fight it, but it's an interesting way to sort of start to round yourself out. And if you want to go in-house and be like a general counsel, you could get all this different experience.
Amazing. You've had so much experience with just such dynamic roles, which is really fascinating. I'd love to sort of talk about what you're doing nowadays, which is M-City and teaching at the Zell Entrepreneurship Clinic. So maybe you can talk about what M-City is and what kind of work you're doing over there.
Yes. So M-City is our autonomous vehicle testing ground here on the campus of University of Michigan. It was the first of its kind. And so it's a place where instead of testing your car on the public streets, you can take it in this very safe environment, and any kind of interaction that your car might have, you can practice it here. So any type of street condition or gravel or terrain, it's been equipped for a long time with the latest advancements in connectivity. So, 5G long before 5G existed, different types of signals that they might. And so you can really test out how this car is going to interact before you put it on the street with people. And we have what we call M-City 2.0, which is creating a very authentic digital twin of our testing environment so that technology companies don't have to physically bring their car here. They can tap in and start doing simulated miles. And we have sensors all over Ann Arbor in the intersections that are feeding real-time driver behavior into our simulation. It's really hard to simulate realistic driving. So we need real drivers and all the crazy things they do, all the crazy things pedestrians do, and dogs and random stuff coming into the street. We can get that real world data and put it into our digital twin, and also open that digital twin up to companies that maybe aren't here in Michigan or can't afford to fly in their car and test it here. So that's what M-City does. And my job at M-City is to really work on the legal research side of things and to put out research at a practical level that can answer some of the questions we need answered so that we can get these cars on the road safely and ethically.
So it's manufacturers or students or researchers working on this type of
All
stuff?
of the above. So it began as a public-private partnership between the University of Michigan, the state of Michigan, who was interested in seeing this happen, and then a lot of the auto manufacturers and other related companies, so like State Farm or AT&T, who wanted to put in the money to make this exist. And so they have access to the test facility, but there's also just a lot of research that goes on through the university. And then they also want to make themselves available. So the bigger companies are subsidizing some of the startups in the area that want to come in. And so there's sort of like a startup entrepreneurship wing to M-City to support these startups in the area.
So I want to understand, like, what are some of the legal issues or challenges that you're working on at M-City?
Oh yeah, we've just got through doing a lot of privacy research of sort of answering these questions about data, and there's so many. So one of the really awesome things that connected cars are going to be able to do is just give us a lot of data that can make roads safer. And to do that, we need to upload this data to central systems. And we're trying to figure out who should own those systems and how can we make data safer and who owns that data. As someone uploading my data from my car, do I own the rights to that data, and can I withdraw it at any time? One of the key aspects of a lot of privacy bills you see, whether it's California or privacy laws, California to Europe, is you have the right to delete your data anytime you want. You can contact the company and say, delete everything, and they have to do it. What's it going to be like with infrastructure that can read our cars? How does it work when, we need to consent to privacy policies and privacy regulations, but multiple people may drive a car, or maybe a minor might drive a car, someone who's 16 or 15 with their beginner's license. How do all these things play out? So do some research there. What might liability look like, and what kind of legal regime should we structure to make this efficient, to make it where people actually want to drive these cars? And so just all the random things like that. Think about where are some gaps in the regulation, which is everywhere, that we need to address, and how can we do that? Looking at other countries doing a lot of international comparisons to places in Europe or places in Asia that are also working on this. What do their regulations look like? What can we learn? What can we learn from them?
And is the US behind other countries in this?
Yeah, yeah. We're so it was in a way the lack of regulation was good in terms of it let a lot of free space and didn't cost a lot of money to comply. But at some point, things will need to be regulated, and companies need to know which direction our regulation is going to head in. So an example would be there were two competing technologies for car connectivity, and we weren't sure which one was going to win out. And other countries were saying, okay, the regulations say use this one. This is the safest one. So use this one. And car companies are like, cool, we will put that one in and go forward. Whereas in the US, we're like, we don't know we're not going to invest in one because we don't know which way this is going to go. And so, the Obama administration picked one technology and it was supposed to go into place, I think, 2018. And GM, we started putting this technology in the cars, and then we had a change in administration, and Trump was very famously like removing regulations, and then that regulation got removed, and so then we're like, okay, we don't need this anymore, stop putting it in. And we still don't. We just now are starting to get some indication that the government has indeed selected one of these to be the one that we're going to use. And so now companies can feel confident going forward with what we're using now, because you need the government on board. A lot of this is going to have to be in, infrastructure is going to need to include these, right? If we want our cars to talk to red lights, if we want our cars to talk to the cloud and let emergency vehicles through, like this is going to take the government being on board as well, and a lot of money from the government. And so we all need to play in this together. And I feel like we've been just sort of waiting for leadership in this space, and we haven't really had that. So we're definitely behind in regulation. It had not been a problem for a while, but like we're starting to see like we need some indication of which direction we're going to go in.
And how do you see this field going in the next 10 to 20 years? Do you think this is just going to exponentially increase in demand, especially from a legal perspective? Is this something young and early lawyers should be looking into as a super hot field, I guess?
Yeah, privacy for sure, because privacy just touches a lot of things. And it's one of those areas that's going to be changing a lot over the next several years, right? Right now, we're having states roll out their own privacy laws because we don't have a federal comprehensive privacy law like Europe has, or like other countries have. But eventually the federal government is going to pass one. You can't have each state having different privacy rules. It just, when you have a website that's available to anybody in the United States, it's really hard to comply, and that hurts entrepreneurship. And so we're going to pass a federal one. And then when we do, we're all going to be we're all going to be the same level of expert, right? Like you have constitutional scholars that have been doing it for 50 years. They are the expert. Nobody's going to be an expert in a law that just passed, right? And so for a new attorney that's building out a career, it's really a great way. You can be more of an expert than someone with twice your number of years practicing, right? Because you got in on it early.
That's awesome. Cool. And we'll just talk about the last thing is your work as a clinical assistant professor and leading the Zell Entrepreneurship Clinic. Maybe you can talk about that and also talk about the value of helping out these first-time founders with the Entrepreneurship Clinic.
Yeah, I wish I had done something like this in law school. I think I probably still would have jumped around a lot in my career because I love variety, which is why I love startup law. But I think I would have been targeted. I would have been a little more targeted in what I was doing. But basically, I take second and third year students, and they come in and they work in teams. And we basically operate like a law firm that doesn't charge. And we work with early stage companies to help them with whatever transactional type legal needs they might have. So maybe they don't have an entity. And so we help them pick between all the different choices, LLC, corporation, different states, and get that, set up. And if they're co-founders, maybe we help them decide, how to split their equity up. And if they want to have, vesting, and if they're thinking about getting funding, what might that look like? Or if they have people helping to create their business, making sure there's IP agreements in place. So the company, this is one of the big mistakes entrepreneurs make, is not making sure that everyone working on creating IP is transferring that IP to the company. So we just make sure they don't make these early level mistakes. And we work mostly and primarily with student entrepreneurs. So we support, entrepreneurship here at the University of Michigan. And so they're, not making the mistakes that can hurt them later on down the line. And then the students are getting an opportunity to practice this before they graduate and learning a lot about themselves, what kind of lawyer they want to be in a lot of ways. So do they even like working with startups? Do they like doing transactional work? Do they like startup law? And is there any area of law they like in particular? I just popped off, IP law, corporate law, corporate and governance, and employment law, and contracting. Like, they get to practice a lot of different types of law. So they might focus in like, hey, I really love writing contracts, or I love employment law. This is a lot of fun. Sometimes they learn they don't like any of this, right? And this was a good experience, but I don't like working with startups. They are emotional and they change their mind a lot and they're all over the place. I personally love that, but that's okay not to like it, right? This is an important time to figure that out. So they get
So
to
getting that exposure is important to know what you like and what you don't like.
Exactly. And for a lot of students, they build out their professional confidence. So when you go and you start your first job, you're learning how to do your job. You're learning maybe the politics of the corporate environment. You're learning how to be a professional. And so some of this we're just taking off their plate. You're learning how to be a professional here. You're learning how to interview your client. You're learning how to present yourself as an attorney. You're learning some of the law. And so it's just less of a lift and less of a, scary moment when you walk into your first job. You're like, okay, I've done a little bit of this before. You can kind of start off on a good foot and start off with a little bit of confidence, and that can really help your career too.
That's awesome. Cool. Before we wrap, is there anything else that you want to talk about in your career, or anything that's really important to you that you think would be inspirational for, say, young or attorneys just starting out?
I would just say, I think one thing, I've never been afraid to change directions. And oh, I will say this was not me in law school. I get that question the last day of class. I do a ask me anything for me and my other professors, and like, you can ask us anything you want. And I get that question sometimes of like, are you surprised at the way your career turned out? Like, what were you like in law school? In law school, I was quiet and I was shy and I was unsure of myself. Like a lot of law students are feeling, a lot of imposter syndrome. I would have been shocked to find out I had the career I had, because I
Wow.
wasn't into taking risks. I wasn't confident, and so some of it has been a little bit begrudgingly. Like, if I could have been hired at a startup law firm, I would very have happily have taken a W-2 job and been a faithful employee, right? I'm not like, oh, I really want to go just forge on my own and do my own thing. That's not that wasn't my personality. What it is now. And so, I was just, really, so like, the moments of reflection when I've thought about like, what do I want to do with my career, have been really helpful, leaning on building out a network, and also realizing like, you change over time. So don't feel super limited. You're going to be okay. Right. And don't be afraid if you're unhappy in what you're doing, don't be afraid to start making a plan. Like, none of these changes were like that. Right. I
Yeah.
worked with a consultant and it took me months to make that change. And so every change I've made it's not been like that. It's not been like, oh, I don't like this, or I want this experience right now. You have to put things in place. So if you realize, hey, this is not what I thought it was, or I'm not happy, make a plan, and you can get yourself into a place that you really enjoy.
Love that advice. And it's interesting looking back too, right? Like, there might have been moments where you're like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? But then
Oh
you
yeah.
look back and you see, like, I was doing entrepreneurship law. I started my own firm and now I'm teaching it. Or,
Yes.
I was working with autonomous vehicles and now I'm leading the whole legal team at M City. So
Hmm.
it's just, looking back, it's not always clear when you're in the moment that,
No.
this is going to lead to something amazing. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I usually have guest speakers come in 4 to 5 every semester, and I always try to pick people that are maybe in house or at a big law firm, but they're doing what they love, right? And they're doing something really interesting. And across the board, that's the story of, no, people don't plan out their careers. They just kind of happen, and you take advantage of opportunities that are in front of you, if you're willing to make the step, right? But it doesn't feel that way when you're in it. You're just, you're shy, like I was when I was leaving my law firm to start my own thing. And you don't see how the skills that I picked up in the lighting authority, the management skills I learned as a general counsel, how I use those like in my job today. And they feel very disconnected, but I can look at the things I'm doing today and see that I'm successful at it because of something I picked up at this job, or a mistake I made, like a really bad mistake I made at this job that I learned from. And so I can look back and kind of weave this narrative, but it does not feel like that when you're in the moment. So just make the best choices you can, stop and check in with yourself and see if you're happy. And if you're not, figure out like, how do I, what might make me happy and how do I get there?
Amazing. This was fantastic. Thank you so much for your insights, Tiffany. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. This was fun. Thank you.